Okay, so let's dive into the really complex story of Sri Lanka, specifically in 2011. This is just 2 years after its long, brutal civil war finally came to an end. Now, you'd think the fighting being over would be the end of the story, but really, the country was heading down two totally different paths at the exact same time.
Right, so in 2009, a final decisive military victory brought that 26-year conflict to a close. And for so many people, this moment sparked this huge wave of optimism. A real feeling that a new era of peace and maybe even more importantly, prosperity was about to begin.
But that's the big question, isn't it? What does peace actually look like on the ground? Well, this explainer, which is based on analysis from the Asian Survey Journal, it digs into the two very different realities that were taking shape in post-war Sri Lanka. One was a story of a booming nation, and the other, well, it was a story of a deeply troubled reconciliation.
So first up, for the government and the majority Sinhalese population, this post-war period felt like a clear-cut story of triumph. It was a time of incredible, visible progress.
The ruling party, the UPFA, did an amazing job of turning its military victory into a massive political one. Just look at these local election results. They show just how tight their grip on power was across most of the country. It was a huge popular mandate.
And all that political stability, it directly fueled the economy. It just roared back to life. The predicted growth for 2011 was a staggering 8.1%. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some number on a spreadsheet. For a lot of people, this felt like real, tangible forward momentum.
And this boom was something you could actually see and feel. Tourism was flourishing. Huge new infrastructure projects like new expressways were connecting the country like never before. Even agriculture was starting to bounce back in the old conflict zones. And, crucially, the business community saw all this happening and threw its support firmly behind the government.
But, this whole picture of progress, it looks completely different when you shift your focus to the war-torn north and east, which is the heartland of the Tamil community.
For the Tamil population, the government's whole approach to reconciliation was met with a lot of suspicion. The promise of a new beginning raised some really serious questions about what was actually being offered and what was maybe being taken away in the process.
Now, to really get what's going on here, you have to understand this one key political tension. The government was all in on a strong, centralized, unitary state, but many in the Tamil community were asking for devolution, basically a transfer of power to the regions, which was something they'd been promised in the past.
And this right here gets to the heart of the paradox. On one hand, the government's offer was all about economic development, new roads, helping people resettle. But the reality on the ground was heavy-handed military control. All the development was coming from the top down with zero local input. And there was this constant fear of the state grabbing land under the cover of security.
So what did the Tamil community do? They sent a loud and clear message at the ballot box. They overwhelmingly voted for the Tamil National Alliance, the TNA. This huge win was basically a direct rejection of the government's economics over politics strategy. They were saying, hey, roads and bridges are great, but they are no substitute for our political rights. And look, this tension, it wasn't just happening up in the north. All across the island, there were these worrying signs that the space for any kind of democratic dissent was getting smaller and smaller.
So here's the crucial point. The main opposition parties were a mess. They were totally fractured. That meant the government faced almost no real pressure at home. This emboldened them to crack down on the media, to imprison political rivals like the former army chief Sarath Fonseca, and to bring the military into all sorts of civilian affairs.
And then you have this quote from the powerful defense secretary who is also the president's brother. This just lays it all out on the table. While diplomats might have been making vague promises about reform to the international community, back home, the message was crystal clear: no more political concessions. The conversation about devolution was, for them, over. So while the government was busy tightening its grip on power at home, the rest of the world was really starting to take notice and raise from serious alarm bells. Now, the government had tried to get ahead of this by creating its own internal reconciliation committee. But in April 2011, a UN report landed like an absolute bombshell, and it just changed the entire conversation overnight. The report came out with this one absolutely staggering number, an estimate that as many as 40,000 civilians may have been killed in the brutal final months of the war. A number that big just forced the world to look much, much closer at exactly how that war was won. The UN panel didn't pull any punches. It accused both the government forces and the LTTE of failing to respect international law. And here's the critical part. It said that Sri Lanka's own internal efforts at accountability weren't good enough, and it called for an independent, international investigation. And the government's response? It wasn't to engage. It was pure defiance. They flat out rejected the UN report. When a devastating documentary aired on British TV, they just released their own counter video. And instead of addressing these calls for accountability, they just doubled down on their relationships with allies like China, who they knew wouldn't pressure them on human rights.
So, where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves us with the central dilemma of Sri Lanka in 2011, a nation that was somehow moving in two opposite directions at the very same time.
So you end up with this paradox, right? On the surface, you have a nation that's experiencing real economic growth, real stability. But just underneath all of that, the actual root causes of its 30-year conflict, political grievances, questions of justice, ethnic divisions, they weren't just being ignored, they were actively being pushed down. And this is the fundamental question that was hanging over Sri Lanka's future then, and frankly, it's a question that's still relevant today. Can a peace that's built only on new roads and security, without justice, without accountability, and without real political compromise, can that kind of peace truly last?